Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I painted this snowy landscape using salt for the salt trees, but also it was kind of a spontaneous landscape. I didn't know where it was going when I started, and so I'll give you my best tips and tricks for that as well. So let's get started. First, let's talk about salt. I have a scrap piece of paper here, and we are going to do a little experiment just to test out our salt and see how it works and how we want to use it to create these salt trees for this landscape. So I have a little bowl of kosher salt that I keep on my desk for any type of salt needs. And first we're going to paint a line. I'm using a cerulean blue. And I am starting with a really light watery wash of the mixture, and then I'm slowly adding more pigment to the same mixture on my tray and then adding it to the line. So on the very far left, it's very light, it's got the most water, and then slowly I added pigment till we have the one on the far right. And then I sprinkled salt across the top of it while everything was still wet, and I wanted to see what would happen. This is a little bit of a time lapse here. What would happen based on the amount of pigment versus water in the mixture. I also like to hit my paintings with salt with a little bit of a heat gun or a blow dryer just to make sure it's super, super dry before I remove the salt, because if the salt is not completely dry, the painting is not completely dry, you will smear paint with the salt all over the place. So not very fun. I also like to use a large soft wash brush to kind of help me remove the salt with the bristles, but if they're stubborn, I just use the other end of the brush, the handle, to kind of scrape off some of that salt, and we can see the results of our experiment. It actually really helps to have a lot of water versus pigment in your ratio. Because what happens is the salt takes the water in. So salt sucks in water, which is why you're not supposed to drink salt water when you're in the ocean, because the salt actually takes the water out of your body, and so you become more dehydrated. So it kind of does the same thing with watercolor. The salt is kind of sucking up the water and the pigment and creating these kind of sparkly snowflake shapes and textures, which is really fun for creating snow, for creating this icy tree effect that we want to do today. For this next little experiment, I wanted to see if the salt reacted differently to different colors. So I mixed up a medium wash of my magenta, cyan, and yellow, and I just dropped the salt right on top and wanted to see if they reacted differently from each other, if one had more contrast or less contrast, and so on. And then I also thought, I wonder what it looks like, because I usually in these experiments drop a lot of salt. So I wanted to see what would it look like if I dropped a couple of pieces of salt versus a lot of salt. So I did a little experiment for that, and then no time lapse this time, but after it's completely dry, we can see how they've reacted. So the magenta actually reacted the best, I think, at a medium wash, had the biggest, bloomiest reaction. That cyan still struggled, but I think it's because I just still didn't have enough water in the mixture, because along the bottom is cyan as well, and I'm still getting really nice blooms. The yellow had a beautiful reaction as well. It's just not as high of contrast because it's more of a lighter pigment. But I do like the way it looks with just a couple of pieces of salt, so that gives us some information as we go into trying to use salt to create this icy tree look in our landscape next. All right, now that we know how the salt is going to work, let's see if we can get it to work for us in painting trees. Now, I call this a spontaneous landscape because I only know a couple of things going into it. I know that I want the bottom third of the painting to be left without water and paint so that it looks like white snow on the ground. So I'm painting the upper 2/3 of my paper. I also know that I am going to be using some kind of blue, and I just kind of mixed a couple of different blues on my palette here, between cerulean and indigo. That's all I have on my limited palette. I did add a little bit of magenta, and I'm going to dab that onto the upper 2/3 of my paper while it's still wet, letting everything flow. But because of the experiment that we did earlier, I know that I really need a lot of water. I need a lot of fluid. It cannot be too pigmented or it's not going to give us the bloom that we're looking for to create the trees. So I'm trying to get a nice ratio of pigment in there while also keeping it very wet. I also know going into this painting that I wanted to use salt to create this icy tree look. And I tried to have some areas of the salt going higher and, keeping some lower. But other than that, I didn't know where this painting was going because I really wanted the snowy look of the trees after everything dries to kind of tell me what was going to happen. So this is another time lapse. We're watching the salt do its thing and suck up all that water and create the trees. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to paint this landscape spontaneously is I wanted to make the landscape based on what the salt told me was going to happen because I have no idea the shapes that are going to form when I place the salt. I used my large wash brush to paint the painting, and so I'm using a flat brush to remove the salt, but I just really love the shapes that were created. Down here at the bottom, they're really bulbous and full together, and so it reminded me of bushes. So I'm just trying to plan out, okay, it's really dark over here on the left. Maybe I'll do a pine tree, some small trees to the left, and then a big tree over to the right above the bushes. That's kind of where my mind is going, and I'm trying to plan out what I'm going to do to kind of execute that story. So I'm going to mix up a cool brown for the tree branches and the trunk of the tree. I have a very limited palette. This is cad yellow, magenta, cerulean, indigo, and sap green, all from Winsor and Newton. On my Pottery by Eleni ceramic pieces, I am really loving this palette. I love using a limited palette, and I like making browns from the primary colors, magenta, yellow, and cerulean. And then I lean more towards the magenta and the cerulean to give me a very cool tree trunk tone because I want these trees to feel icy and I also want them to feel a little bit farther away. This is more the background trees. So I'm letting the blooms help me tell the story. So I wanted this tree trunk kind of tucked behind the blooms that I felt like were creating the bushes. And then I'm trying to connect some of these outer blossoms that the salt created to the main trunk without having, just a big solid line. We want it to look like there's these icy bunches in between the branches. So we just need to skip through and kind of add little flicks of tiny branches. Remember that with trees, the trunk is going to be the largest part, and then every time it branches out, it gets a little bit smaller. And then as it gets to the very, very end, the very tip top of the tree, it's going to be the smallest branch. Sometimes I see my students paint trees where the branches are almost just as thick as they are at the end of the tree, as they are towards the trunk of the tree. And so just keep that in mind. It'll help your trees look so much more proportionally accurate and you'll be a lot happier with them. So I'm just trying to feel out what looks right because I'm trying to tell the story that the blossoms created by the salt has already given me. And I'm adding trunks and branches here and there as it feels right and just keeping it in that lighter, cool tree trunk tone. Okay, so we've got our trunks and our branches down. I didn't want to add too much because I don't want it to be busy. I don't want the bushes to be too busy either, but I did want them to have a little bit of dimension. So with a bluish indigo color that was already on my palette, I'm kind of adding a little bit of texture towards the base and also defining some of the bushes in front by kind of negatively painting around them just a little bit. I just wanted to give a little bit of roundness and depth to the bushes. Now we're going to mix up a sap green indigo color because I'm going to paint a pine tree over here on this left side. It was really dark, the salt didn't really take to that area as well, so I thought, well, let's just kind of cover it up with a big giant pine tree. So I am using a darker greenish blue and I'm just kind of blocking in the shape, not really caring too much about texture or detail because we're going to add some white gouache over the top of it later to give it that really snowy effect. So we just need to block in the general shape of it and we can figure out more of the details later. I did kind of struggle with figuring out how to pair the bottom of this pine tree with this tree that I had painted in the background because I knew I wanted this pine tree in front, but I didn't think it looked right. And so I just ended up adding some water to that area right here and then tapping it out with a paper towel and then kind of making the details go around it a little bit. In the end, I fussed over it a little bit too much, and when I add the white gouache for snow, it wasn't going to matter anyway. So we're going to leave that there for now. But at this point, I was starting to wonder what I was going to do with the snowy part of the landscape. I thought about adding a walkway, maybe a fence. The proportions were not right for adding a building because all of the trees appeared too close and there was no room for it. So I knew it needed to be something on the ground that added movement. But I did want to start adding rocks to help with the transition from the snow into the trees. So I just did these loose kind of scraggly rocks. I'll do some more later, but I used that kind of side swiping motion to save some of the paper for some of the highlight and snow on the rock. And then I'm using indigo to just kind of add some details to the pine tree. This is the point where I really wasn't sure what I was going to do, and so I just start adding shadow and contrast until I figured out. It's like my thinking process. So I started adding contrast and shadow into the pine tree. Then I thought, okay, let's add some contrast and shadow into the tree trunks and the branches of these trees. And it was at some point along this process that I realized, well, I could just do like a frozen lake. That's always an easy one, especially with watercolor. You can make, the water look really icy. And so that's what I ended up doing. All right, so let's talk about how to paint a lake so that it looks like a lake and not just a blue blob on the paper. The first is you want to use the right colors. We're going to use some light blue to start because we do want some lighter areas glistening off the water and in this case the ice. But we do want lots of shadowy colors, so think adding greens, magentas. We want a lot of really rich, deep, cool, icy colors, especially since our lake is frozen. The other thing that you really want to do is have the right angles. So right here in the corner, I am trying to create a really sharp point so that it looks like there's a little bit of the bank and the snow that is kind of coming into the lake. This is going to really help give it shape and movement and making also the other straight side of the bank a little bit more uneven. We don't want it to be a perfectly straight line. We want it to have character and movement to it. Same with over here as well. Now, while it's still wet, this is when we're going to start adding in those icy shadows. So I'm adding them along the bank, and I'm just making sure not to add too much because we want the highlight to reflect because it's so icy. We need some of that coolness and the brightness. So we're going to make sure to stop in that corner there and then bring some down on the bottom where that bank kind of juts out. And you can see just by adding the shadow and having really sharp angles and an uneven shape, it's already really looking like a lake. So now that the lake is in, I feel like I had a very clear vision of where I wanted this painting to go, and it was just about adding the details from here on out. So shadows in the snow, more and more rocks. I got really into the rocks for this painting, which I really like because I feel like when I've visited a lake, it's less and less trees as you get down close to the lake and more rocks. So the rocks, don't forget about the rocks. I love to use purpley blues and reds for my rocks and then kind of add colors to bleed and blend for some shadow and some cool tones. The best thing that we can do now is just continue to tell the story of this lake. We are going to build up the colors in the bank to add some dirt and some detail, shadows and dirt and detail all throughout the snow, and continue to layer everything as it continues to dry. Now that we've finished the details, we are going to add some white gouache to our pine tree over here to the left. I like to use the white of the paper as much as I can when I'm painting snow, but sometimes it's just really fun to paint the snow on top of a pine tree with gouache. I am just using the gouache straight from the tube. It's my favorite way to use it. I don't like to put it on my palette because I feel like it messes with the rest of my paints, making them a little bit too opaque for my liking. And then I just like to kind of place it in chunks, like how snow would fall and kind of mesh together, remembering that it's going to be kind of on the tops of the pine needles. So I'm making the snow chunks kind of at the top, leaving some greenery on the bottom where we can add some more details in a minute. And then I'm just going to go around the painting and see what else might need a little bit more of a chunkier bit of snow before we do some splatters. So I'm just kind of placing it on the rocks and on some of the tree branches, but not too much. Okay, now we're going to get to the splatter, which can be fun, but it can be frustrating, especially if it's not splattering the way that you want. I feel like I get the best splatter when I'm using my pencil or another brush to hit against my brush that's got the white paint very hard. So I go back and forth between adding water to my brush so that it's watery enough to splatter, and then adding gouache to my brush, and then adding maybe some more water or just using it a little bit thicker. If I do this really hard strike with a paintbrush against my other paintbrush, I feel like I get a nice, pretty even, good chaotic splattering of snow, and I don't really get the lines or like the shooting star look, so it gives me that good snow coverage that I'm looking for. After we're finished with the snow splatter, we're just going to add a few more details to make sure we have the right level of contrast to all of the elements in our landscape. Because we have so many light parts of our landscape, like all of these crystallized trees in the background, we need to really make sure that the shadows and the details are popping and have enough contrast that the lighter areas shine. So just a little bit of contrast and shadow in the grass on the ground and up here in the pine tree, and we'll do some on the rocks as well. I also did another glaze of color over the top of the lake. I feel like I could have kept it just how it was, but I really wanted some of these shadows to be really dark and deep. And if you look at how it looks right now and then how it looks at the end, I feel like it was a good choice. It really made the bank of this lake pop even more and look really realistic with the shadows. Just make sure you add enough water that everything blends down and you don't have very harsh lines. We want to keep the lake, because it is probably frozen over, we want it to have a really icy and cold look. So having that wet on wet technique where everything is nice and blended and there's not any harsh lines is going to be important, while also maintaining some of the brightness of the water. A few more final details before we are completely done. I love using like a purpley red color for the final bit of contrast on rocks or dirt. It is just such a nice deep color without being like gray or blue or black. And that is it. That is it. I hope you enjoyed watching this process of me trying to figure out what I was doing through some of it. Like I said, I only knew a couple of things that I really wanted going into this painting, but I wanted the salt to kind of tell me where the painting was going, and I feel like in the end it turned out really, really great. I mean, when in doubt, add a frozen lake, right? I will see you all in my next video real soon. Bye.